Hello, everyone, and welcome to New Hampshire Peace Action's Peace and Justice Conversation Series online. I'm Will Hopkins. I'm the director of New Hampshire Peace Action. If you are new to our organization, New Hampshire Peace Action educates, mobilizes, and organizes to build a more peaceful and just future for all. We envisage a future where international relations are based on cooperation instead of competition and conflict, and where mutual benefit and shared security lead to a more peaceful and just global community. The corona pandemic spurred us to start this biweekly conversation series as a way to continue our public education work. And now, after over 2 years of the conversation series, we're finding it so effective at bringing in voices that we might not otherwise be able to hear, and at also effective at getting folks who might not otherwise be able to make it to hear these voices. That we're going to continue it as long as we can. We're hoping that this conversation series helps us engage and sort out how to make the changes we've been yearning for. And in that spirit of understanding and respect, we want to acknowledge that we're doing our work here in New Hampshire on the traditional ancestral homeland of the Abenaki, Pennacook, and Wabanaki peoples, past and present. We honor with gratitude the land and waterways that they've been stewarding throughout the generation. A bit on Zoom etiquette. We're happy to have anybody who wants to keep their video on to leave it on, but we are live streaming. So if you have a problem with your name or face on the internet, you can turn off your camera or change your name. We do ask that folks keep their audio muted if they're not the ones talking. And I think that's about it. We're gonna jump in and introduce the speaker. So with the crisis continuing to unfold in Ukraine and ongoing suffering and violence in Yemen and Iran, we've invited Kury Petersen-Smith. He's the Michael Ratner Fellow for Middle East Policy at the Institute for Policy Studies. He's going to be giving us an update tonight on the world's hot spots and what we can do to help shape a U.S. foreign policy that leads to safety and security for everyone. So Kury is the Michael Ratner Middle East Fellow at the Institute for Policy Study, which is the place that I go when I need to understand an issue inside and out, and I don't have 18 hours to learn it. I've got to learn it in a couple articles. And I started to get excited about inviting Kury to come speak to New Hampshire Peace Action probably I think it was about 6 months ago, when I noticed that like 3/4 of what IPS was putting out, and IPS has always been my go-to place, is coming from this one guy who had never heard speak before. And so I know for me, I'm really excited, not just because I love your work and I've come to depend on your work, but also because I'm in admiration of your work on the Black Solidarity with Palestine statement and other work you've done. So without any more from me, I just want to say thank you so much for being with us tonight, Kury, and introduce you to New Hampshire Peace Action. So take it away.
Thank you, Will, and thank you all. This is, I must say, well, first of all, I'm joining you as a neighbor. I'm right here in Dorchester in Boston, here in Massachusetts and Wampanoag lands. So I'm just down the road, and look forward to someday, when it makes sense, seeing each other in person. But even kind of sharing, beyond sharing this region, just sharing this virtual space, this really feels like a lovely, warm space. In a time, in a country where those feel quite precious and few and far between. So it's a real honor, and I'm very grateful to join you. And, you know, at the Institute for Policy Studies, it's a think tank, and what distinguishes IPS from other think tanks is we try to be a resource for social movements whose purpose are changing the world. You know, most think tanks want to keep the world exactly as it is, but we want it to change in pretty transformative ways. And so we work to be a resource, and with groups like yours, that are around this country, kind of doing the work of challenging militarism and working toward demilitarization. And so I'm really joining you all in conversation tonight to talk about our collective project, because that's the big question is, what are we going to do in this time? There's a lot of action that I think we need to take, but there's also a lot of reflection I think we need to have. And I want to start there. Particularly last year, which was the 20th anniversary of the US invasion of Afghanistan, the 20th anniversary of the 9/11 attacks and the beginning of the war on terror, which also happened to be the year that the US withdrew, so to speak, from Afghanistan. When the US withdraws from places, it's never quite a withdrawal in the way that we want, but it was very significant, and the kind of close of a chapter. And I was quite optimistically hoping that it would be an occasion for pause in this country to say, okay, the war on terror has been going on for 20 years. Let's take stock of it. It has been catastrophic from every perspective, first and foremost from a humanitarian perspective, especially and primarily for the people in the places that have been invaded and occupied and surveilled. Tens of millions of people displaced, countless people killed and wounded. Of course, it has been devastating for people in this country for many reasons. Hundreds of thousands of people in this country cycling through combat zones with basically no conversation about it domestically. The many people in this country, particularly Muslim folks, folks of Middle Eastern and South Asian descent and North African descent, who've been subject to incredible surveillance and violence. And there's so much devastation. But even from a military perspective, these wars have not worked. For the people who launched them, none of their objectives have been achieved. And what crystallizes that more clearly than the withdrawal from Afghanistan, where the Taliban won after 20 years, for what? So I really thought, wow, all of the media are going to have these fantastic conversations. They'll bring on the most insightful people to assess these 2 decades. They will finally invite, Muslim folks who have experienced, this violence domestically and around the world to come and speak about what that's like. And I will say I was very moved to see that Muslim folks, particularly in this country, after years of forced silence, did speak out quite a bit last year and in the years prior as well, and talk about what the surveillance and the detentions and the wars in places that are very dear to them, what those have been like. But there was not the kind of reflection or reckoning at all in the halls of power, in the mainstream media, who bear tremendous responsibility for their role in these wars. So that was last year. And then next year is the 20th anniversary of the invasion of Iraq. So it's like, look, if the institutions of this country won't pause and reflect, then certainly we in the peace movement can and must, and we should reflect and learn not only about the impacts of all of these wars and all of the broader militarism, but I think we actually need to reflect on our own activities as activists and think about what has worked and what hasn't, and where we need to go. So I see this conversation in that vein, and I'm very grateful to have it. And now I'll move on to the bad news, which is that not only has this not been a time for reflection, but it's actually, I'm sorry to say that we're in the midst of a new round of militarization. Actually, we are on track to leave this year with a larger military budget than what we entered it with more U.S. troops deployed in Europe than when we started this year, with more profits for weapons manufacturers, record profits. The crisis in Ukraine, Russia's horrendous, inexcusable, indefensible invasion of Ukraine, has meant many things, but one of those things is I think it has been another opportunity for reflection in this country. I mean, for so many people here, invasion and war and displacement have become visible in ways that it hasn't been. Now, I think that's complicated. I think we should ask why war is visible in Ukraine in a way that it hasn't been for Americans in Iraq and in Afghanistan, in Yemen, in Somalia, in many other places. We should have that conversation. And also, that should be part of a conversation that we participate in that recognizes what it means for war to be visible to people in this country, for a population that has been so systematically desensitized to war, to become sensitive to it, is very important. And yet, again, though, unfortunately, instead of this kind of automatically translating into a move to demilitarize things, it has been used, I think that the reasons why the sentiment that we might feel for the people of Ukraine, we shouldn't assume that that is the exact motivation for the people in Washington as they make their decisions. The very human response that we feel and our neighbors feel, I don't think is what's guiding another $40 billion for Ukraine, which is really overwhelmingly for US weapons manufacturers and to support the deployment of more US troops, et cetera, et cetera. When, the State Department's Jake Sullivan gleefully celebrates that Finland and Sweden, these formerly neutral countries, which, we can have another conversation about their neutrality, sell weapons, but whatever, these neutral countries, how wonderful it is that they're joining the world's greatest military alliance, is what he called it. He's not operating on the same basis that we are. And I'm sorry to say that I think that the sentiment, again, that human sentiment that so many people in this country and people around the world feel is being manipulated, or it's being taken advantage of by, officials to pursue what have actually been long-term plans. It's not the first moment that anybody thought of Sweden and Finland joining NATO. This has been a desire for a long time, or for Germany to raise its threshold of military spending and weapons sales, and for other European states to do the same. And of course, the desire to have a US military budget that is $800 billion has been a plan that they've wanted for a long time, and they've talked about China being the threat, and that will justify, the kind of curious fact that at a time when the US is supposedly withdrawing from wars, we need to increase the military budget. How can we sell that? And I'm sorry to say that Putin's invasion of Ukraine has given them the golden opportunity. So that's bad news, and it's not just Ukraine, it's not just Europe. The president at the moment is in Japan, continuing to rally Asia, which is something that has been done for years and a couple of decades now, to kind of shore up an alliance against China. There are new unprecedented US-Japanese joint military exercises that are being done in the name of combating China. When I think about, it's not just that what the US is doing, but the US's allies, Israel is intensifying its violence. The assassination of a journalist, Shirin Abu Akleh, in broad daylight, in cold blood. It's not just Israel, it's the United Arab Emirates, it's Saudi Arabia, these states that, that Trump so brutishly and thuggishly embraced. And there was a question of whether we'd see a change in policy under Biden, and we have not. We have seen the growth of the US relations with these countries. So I could go on with the bad news. Let me let me stop there. I think you all get it. We know it, right? So let me shift to this to kind of lead into the conversation that I'm really excited to have with you all, which is a return to that question of what are we going to do about this, as we reflect, as we take stock. What are we going to do? And I've been grappling with that question quite a bit and trying to gather some insights. And here's one that I'll share from some conversations I've been having and some reflection on some really successful examples of demilitarization, which I'm saving those for the end. You always got to end on a on a positive note. But one thing is successful struggles against militarism. A couple of qualities that they seem to have is they are deeply rooted in community where they are, and yet have a sort of global outlook. And that is something to strive for, and I think I've certainly been involved in organizing where I do one or the other. We get very sort of caught up with, what is only on the minds of the people in our community, the people kind of immediately surrounding us. Or we think about what's happening in the world and wish I'd paid more attention to what's going on in the minds of the people that we live with and work with and, go to school with and send our kids to school with and so on. So been thinking about that, and I'll sort of offer that as something to think about. And let me go into a couple of really kind of beautiful examples of demilitarization that I don't think are getting nearly enough attention in light of the really bad stuff going on in the world, but I think kind of hold those qualities. So one is an example that folks may know in Hawaii. It's a place called Red Hill. Red Hill is a military base that's part of, or it's an installation that's part of the broader, what the US calls Pearl Harbor kind of complex of military bases and installations and ships, and and Red Hill has been a fuel station since World War II. This is back before Hawaii was kind of taken as a US state and it was annexed as a US territory. And the US, which had already been expanding its empire in the Pacific in a big way, said, we need to, this is going to be a big project of ours, US power in the Pacific. And so we're going to need places, we're going to need to have more places to fuel our naval ships as they go out into the Pacific. And Red Hill was the key one, this massive fueling installation where they've drilled these fuel tanks into a mountain, and a mountain, the foot at which is a port. And so, ships can kind of dock there, and then the gravity itself lets the fuel flow right into these naval ships. Now, as with so many military installations, this has obviously displaced people who live in this place. It's also contaminated the land and the water for the people in the surrounding communities. It's a giant fuel depot. And so people of Hawaii, the local residents, are facing that displacement. They're facing the contamination. And as with any military bases, they've been enlisted into this global project of violence, that their community is now part of this. And so there has for many years been a struggle against Red Hill, different iterations, usually coming in response to a fuel spill or some other example of contamination, which activists call attention to. And, of course, the powers that be, the military and the local government push back. They say, oh, no, everything is fine. Well, last year, again, after years and years of evidence of contamination, actually, the Navy was forced to evacuate naval personnel and their families who were living on this base because their water was contaminated. And once again, local activists said, hey, if they're evacuating military personnel on the base, what about us? We drink the same water, right? We live in the same community. And so it made for this big kind of upsurge in protests that involved people protesting, having encampments, at this base, going to the Capitol. There's a whole number of groups. There's this great group called Oahu Water Defenders that played a key role. This comes, after there's really a kind of chapter that we're in the midst of indigenous resistance all across this place called the United States, and particularly in Hawaii. Folks may remember that there's a mountain called Mauna Kea that where scientists were working to build a telescope and kind of desecrate this sacred place. And there was a huge struggle against that a couple of years ago in Hawaii. And so once again, there was this amazing mobilization that went into this year, into 2022. And finally, the Hawaii State Board of Health said, okay, these fuel tanks must be drained by the Navy. And actually, we recommend this place be shut down. And the Navy appealed it and then eventually gave in. They said, okay, shut it down. And it's kind of like, when I read that, I thought, really? This almost feels too good to be true. But again, this was years and years and years in the making. And, it hasn't been totally shut down yet, but the tanks have yet to be refilled. And the Navy is talking about exploring, well, I guess we have to evacuate this. I guess we better find some other sites. And obviously, it hasn't taken down the beast of the U.S. Navy in the Pacific, but for them for their key fueling site for them to face that the real setback of not being able to use that is a huge deal. Especially, again, remember what Biden is doing in Japan at this moment is shoring up, U.S. militarism in the Pacific. So that's a huge deal. Again, a struggle that is very rooted in place, very rooted in community, and also has a kind of global outlook. It's not just what's happening to us, but it is the ways that this violence, that we were enlisted in this violence, elsewhere. Okay, one other one that's really cool. Again, not enough attention to it. It's gotten lost in the noise, but there's this really fantastic organization called Dissenters. It's a anti-militarist youth group. Their website is wearedissenters.org. They're worth checking out and kind of following. And they have campus-based chapters across the country. It's a fairly new group, only a couple years old, but their kind of headquarters is in Chicago. And there's another headquarters in Chicago, which belongs to Boeing, the weapons manufacturer and aircraft manufacturer. And Boeing, among other things, was given this 20-year kind of contract by the city of Chicago that included tax breaks and all these incentives for them to have their headquarters in Chicago, which, a city that certainly could use the tax revenue from a major corporation. So it's a harm to the people of Chicago. And of course, what does Boeing do? They are one of the key weapons manufacturers in the world. they also happen to make aircraft, civilian aircraft that don't fly well. I mean, there's a number of reasons they hate Boeing, but it's their weapons manufacturing that is really egregious. Well, dissenters spearheaded this campaign to cancel this contract that the city of Chicago had with Boeing. It was up for renewal actually in December of last year. And the campaign was, we should not renew this contract. Boeing should not get these tax breaks and so on. And so they had these great protests outside of the CEO of Boeing's house. If you're familiar with Chicago, it's the Gold Coast, I think they call it, or the Magnificent Mile. Also, this is where the wealthiest people in Chicago live alongside the lake. That's where the CEO of Boeing lives. So they had rallies outside of his high rise and other forms of protest. And not only did the city of Chicago choose to not renew the lease, but Boeing announced that they're moving their headquarters, which is wasn't even that goes beyond what the campaign hoped for. They're moving it to Virginia, to a community where I think will be more supportive of what they're doing. But again, this massive violent corporation, for them to be set back, to say, to be operating in a community where people say, no, we won't accept business as usual. You can't just comfortably be here, get our tax breaks, kind of donate to some philanthropic causes and think that washes away all of the horrendous violence that you're guilty of, is tremendously inspiring and actually effective. It sets them back. It's a good thing if these companies are not safe, so to speak, to do what they do here in the United States. They think of outside of the US as, the hostile place, but we have our own hostility to their agenda here. Again, this campaign, very rooted in Chicago, working with others who are campaigning against corporations and against policing and all sorts of other things, and also with a global outlook. So that's very hopeful. We should do more to kind of highlight and celebrate and learn from those successes, but we should also do more to build on them. And that's what I think our conversation is about, is what are we doing in a very militarized New England, I must say, where there's tremendous weapons manufacturing. I don't have to tell you all, but what are we doing here? How do we make this moment something that is not just a time of militarization, but a time for critique, for pause and reflection, a time to center the humanity of the people on the receiving end of US violence, and a time to talk about and work toward demilitarization. I'll stop there. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Kury. So folks, as we get into Q&A, you can feel free to type your questions in the chat, or you can use the hand raise function in Zoom, or you could put an asterisk in the chat if you'd like to unmute and ask your question yourself. Don't try raising your hand on the camera. I probably won't see you. I can only see a few windows at the top of my screen. So best is to put an asterisk or use the hand raise function. As we're waiting for people to furiously type their questions in the chat, I'm going to go ahead and sneak my first question in ahead of them, Kury, and that is, you talked about Yemen policy and how the Trump administration was particularly apt to transfer weapons to Yemen, do air refueling intelligence support, satellite support, and how that level of cooperation was beyond what the Obama administration had done, in particular, the amount of weapons we were transferring over. In February of 2020, or 2021, just after taking office, Joe Biden made an announcement that we were no longer going to support the Saudi-led offensive in Yemen. And then when the NDAA came through, it had the funding back in. Are things still at the same level? Was Biden just saying that? What has changed and what hasn't in Yemen?
That's such an important question, because for folks who have been campaigning, for ending the U.S. involvement in the war in Yemen, in a situation that the UN called the world's biggest humanitarian catastrophe until tragically it was eclipsed by other humanitarian catastrophes. Um, uh, there's been work on this for years, and then the Biden administration said, yeah, we're going to end this. We're actually going to end the war in Yemen. And that was, like you said, February of last year. And then the administration ended the year by signing off on a weapons sale to Saudi Arabia, actually. So yeah, it does continue, and it continues not only in terms of the sales, but in terms of the kind of diplomatic embrace of Saudi Arabia and the UAE, particularly the UAE. I remember in the early days of the Russian invasion of Ukraine, there was it was Blinken was in the Middle East, and he on Twitter, Antony Blinken posted about how he's meeting with his counterpart from the UAE to think about how to respond to Russia's aggression. I thought, man, it's not. It's not just that the U.S. is kind of calling attention to Russian violence while ignoring its own violence. It is actually taking the opportunity of Russian violence to justify and embrace its own violence, to say this is a battle between authoritarianism and democracy, and Russia's on the side of authoritarianism, we are on the side of democracy, and so is the UAE, which is shocking. It's shocking given what the UAE does, given what Saudi Arabia does, given what Israel does, given what is happening in the United States right now. It's not looking great for democracy, here. So it's only growing, and I think I appreciate you, Will, kind of laying out a bit of a trajectory actually from Obama to Trump and then to Biden, because one thing that I think we really struggle to grasp in the US is that militarism is a cumulative project. It's not like one administration comes in and does something radically different from the previous. The way militarism works is through an infrastructure, through the construction of bases, through the stationing of ships and weapons and troops, through the passage of laws. And each administration builds on what the previous administration has already done, and that's what we're seeing with Yemen. So what's interesting, and kind of what's interesting right now is that there's a ceasefire with the Yemen, actually, that started with Ramadan, and to be totally honest, it's funny to say this as as an analyst. But I'm not exactly sure what to make of it. Because it is a humanitarian catastrophe in Yemen that hasn't stopped Saudi Arabia before. It hasn't stopped the U.S. or their allies before. This war hasn't gone well for Saudi Arabia, it must be said. So are they trying to figure out an exit strategy? I'm not quite sure. But the ceasefire is temporary by its nature. It's not actually a end to the conflict. So there is an effort right now to make a push among Yemen solidarity activists, and we should kind of we should tune into that. And that's where things are at. The militarism itself has not. All the infrastructure is still there, including the U.S. support. On the ground in Yemen, there's been a bit of a respite. But how do we make that last? Yeah.
So got a couple questions in the chat from Ray that I'll read off. One is in relation to Yemen specifically. So I'll just read it off. So it's on Yemen. Wasn't the Saudi UAE intervention in response to the Iranian-backed Houthi extremist militia taking over the country, and the UN sanctioned the military operation, which went horribly wrong? And then a question that I think you could probably kind of slide into at the end is, isn't military force important to enforce peace in a chaotic world, and where do we draw the line?
Yeah, these are important questions. And I think what I'll say on the first is that there really is a couple things to say about the Middle East at the moment is, again, 20 years after the US's disastrous invasions that were explicitly, from the mouths of U.S. officials about remaking the Middle East, that those, again, did not play out the way that the U.S. kind of hoped and planned. And one of the things that we've seen, I think, in the past couple decades is a real coming of age of other regional powers that have played a much more forward role. That is, I think previously Saudi Arabia, for example, has kind of done its thing, in Saudi Arabia. Saudi Arabia has kind of funded all sorts of horrendous violence around the world, and done plenty of things in the Middle East too. But let the U.S. go ahead and do full-scale invasions, of Iraq, for example, would host U.S. troops and things like that. But for Saudi Arabia to say, we are going to take the lead, actually, we are going to lead this invasion of Yemen, I think represents a kind of recognition of, well, maybe the U.S. isn't the one, at the moment that's in the best position to be invading countries. Maybe it doesn't have to. Maybe we can do that with all these great U.S. weapons. So that's one thing that's happened. It is also the case that Iran has kind of emerged as more of a regional power in the past couple of decades in a way that is related to the U.S.'s setbacks in Iraq and elsewhere. And so as part of that, there is this kind of there's this struggle. There has been a struggle about who gets to which direction will dominate the Middle East. Who will call the shots? Which will be the powers that have the most influence? Will it be on one end, Saudi Arabia, the UAE, Israel, Egypt, Jordan, or will it be Iran? And so there are these proxy conflicts, particularly in Syria and then in Yemen. And so I wouldn't say that Saudi Arabia and the UAE were responding to the Houthis, what the Houthis were doing in Yemen, as much as they have made Yemen a battleground for this kind of contest for who gets to run the Middle East. And the Houthi, this is a Yemeni group. Yemen has its own political questions to sort out, and the notion that Saudi Arabia and the UAE can step in, with the United States, I think is wrong, and I just don't buy it, actually. And I don't buy the notion that the Houthis are this sort of arm of Iran. I don't buy that either. It is the case that when you're having a contest, a sort of geopolitical contest for a region, right, and you're polarizing that region, then various armed forces end up taking sides. You know what I mean? So I don't want to, but let's understand kind of where this is coming from. So that's what I would say in response to that. And certainly when you look at what Saudi Arabia has done, which has been, quite openly and explicitly targeting civilian infrastructure, bridges, water supply, weddings, school buses, folks may remember, bombed. And this is not about making Yemen a safer place. And I guess that does speak to the second question, which I do think that the world is becoming more unstable, and I understand this goes a bit off from your question, Ray, but it reminds me of what the kind of story that is being told in the US right now, particularly about this Russian invasion, that you've got these bad guys who want their way, and there's got to be some hero who steps forward and uses violence for good. And I'm sorry to say that militarism has only escalated the instability in the world. It's made it more chaotic. It's not making it a more peaceful world. So that's the That's what I would say.
Thank you, Kury. Diane, you want to unmute yourself and take it away?
If it's all right to shift the discussion a little bit to this continent, I am wondering if you could talk a little bit about the military significance of Guantanamo Bay. We know about the prison, and because it's so close to our country, why is it there? I mean, why do we need to have a base so close? Are we going to invade Cuba? Probably not. We're trying to undo Cuba from the inside out instead of from the outside in. But how does that base function except as a prison for the United States?
That is such a good question. And it's, I mean, folks will know that there is this enormous network of US bases around the world, depending on how you count them, some 800 bases around the world. And they play different functions. And some of them are very much, or many of them are very clearly kind of combat oriented bases, and others are not. And some are, Guantanamo Bay in the US kind of the base there is such a kind of like sedimented history of US empire itself. I mean, it goes back to the Spanish-American War, which when the US acquired Cuba, in defeating Spain. And while the US was ultimately the US-backed dictatorship in Cuba was overthrown, of course, the Guantanamo Bay base sort of remains as this US legacy. I think that its actual functional purpose has changed over the years. It has, for example, been a site to kind of receive isn't the word. I don't know, capture Haitian refugees, who were wanted to come to the United States. That was one function that it played. At the moment, I think that the prison is the main function. And so I think that they've kind of held on to it, saying, well, there's going to be some utility for this. And there's a lot of, I must say, there's a lot of bases like that. There's a lot of territories like that. I'll share, my family is from the US Virgin Islands, which is also in the Caribbean. And this is a territory that the US acquired in 1917. It serves, from what I can tell, it serves no military purpose anymore. So why does it remain as a US territory? Well, the US has its own, I do think there's like a thing around inertia and a thing around like, well, we just deserve to have these places. And what does it mean to leave? What does that signal? But I think that at the moment, even though Guantanamo doesn't play kind of combat purpose, I think that the role that the US has made it play during the War on Terror is enormous. I mean, it has been the site to kind of pioneer the notion that there are some people who are so bad, they're so awful, that they're not even, if US forces capture them, they're not even prisoners of war. They shouldn't be subject to the Geneva Conventions. They're something else. They're enemy combatants. They created a whole new legal categories for the people at Guantanamo Bay, some of whom have been there for nearly 20 years now, who haven't even been charged with a crime. And they've gotten away with it. I mean, that's the thing, is they've gotten away with it, There was a conversation, folks may remember, during the Obama administration, where there was a kind of, lukewarm, woefully inadequate, in my opinion, effort by the administration to close the prison, say, well, what if we transfer these people to prisons in the continental US? And it's like, well, once again, these people have not been charged with crime, so why are they being in prison? But, and Congress said, no, these people are the worst of the worst. They can't come here, and they got away with it. They maintained this. So I think that's what Guantanamo has been used to do legally has been devastating, but has been enormously useful for the war on terror. And the one thing I'll just add is it's so, and this speaks to the connections between the kind of domestic racist state violence here and the war on terror, is the conversation around Guantanamo, the prison there, so parallels the conversations that happened in the 90s about the creation of supermax prisons. These are for the worst of the worst. You know, there are some people who should never see the light of day. You know, our society's got to lock them up and throw away the key. And I think that Guantanamo Bay is a version of that. And they sort of feed off of each other, actually, this notion of these bad guys that are captured in Afghanistan and then the bad guys who are captured on the streets of the US. So it's like this glaring, you know, stain that Guantanamo Bay remains operational as a prison and remains a US territory. So thank you for calling attention to it.
We don't have questions in the chat right now, which is great for me because I have tons of questions I want to ask you. And I'm wondering if you can. You kind of started to talk about this sense that there's war outside of our borders, and we have Guantanamo Bay as the supermax, and there's war inside our borders. Veterans for Peace, which is an organization I'm a former national board member of, took a lot of flack and lost a lot of members for getting heavily involved with Black Lives Matter, and recognizing that there is militarization and warfare in the Middle East, and there's militarization and warfare against communities here in this country, and that the only thing that really makes them different is whether it's inside our boundaries and outside of our boundaries. And so my question, I mean, you've been organizing and researching in this field and across those lines, I think it's fair to say. And do you think that that we should consider ourselves separate from movements like Black Lives Matter? Here in New Hampshire, Black Lives Matter Nashua is the largest chapter, and they are currently part of New Hampshire Peace Action. They're an organization under our umbrella organizing in Nashua, and that's specifically because we don't think we should discriminate between warfare here and warfare there, and that we recognize it's happening. Do you think that's a good way to frame and a good way to organize?
I mean, that's fantastic to hear. Like there are particular ways that we may organize ourselves, kind of like logistically. Like I think like it's totally cool. Like it's great if like one organization can both, address militarism abroad and militarism here and see them as, continuum or, in circuit with each other. And, you can have different organizations that take on, I mean, militarism is this massive beast, right? Like, so you can have different organizations that have different focuses, but like, we have to have that conversation that sees the connections. I mean, the thing is, and this is the painful irony, like the connections are so organic that they're being like, the proponents of militarism, like they get it. They don't, they know there's not too much of a separation. And I'll just go to this horrific shooting that just happened in Buffalo by a white nationalist. What was he wearing? Military gear. That's not like with a military weapon. That's not like an accident that all of these white nationalist shooters, they could dress up however they want to, and they choose to put on, choose to dress as soldiers. That's not like a coincidence. They see it. They see, the US invasions and occupations and what the US does around the world as part of a white supremacist project and a kind of Western chauvinist project that says that There's certain people who should be in charge, you know, of the whole world. And those people should also be at the top of a violently enforced hierarchy here domestically. They see the connections, you know, the companies that make these weapons, you know, they're making weapons for the domestic market and for the military, you know. So, you know, it's unfortunate. It kind of is what it is, you know, but it's unfortunate that when we don't see the connections, you know. But my goodness, there's this pipeline of military personnel in the police departments. Like you get you know what I mean? Like they recruit, not accidentally, but because they see them, you know, that the police departments understand that in many ways they're going to play a similar function, or that what folks did, you know, in uniform in Afghanistan and Iraq can inform what they do, you know, in police departments here. So yeah, I absolutely think that we have to work on that, and it's like when we don't, it's this strange glaring omission, and I mean that on both sides. Like I am also, it's not just the kind of anti-war peace community, it's also for those of us who are working to confront policing, you know, who oppose armored personnel carriers in our communities. We should oppose them in Afghanistan too, you know what I mean? So we've got to build on that conversation for sure.
Well, I'm still not seeing questions in the chat, and I still have a lot that I want to hear from you about. So please, folks, feel free to raise your hand, put an asterisk in the chat if you want to speak, or type one in. In the meantime, Iran, the JCPOA, Trump pulled us out. Biden promised to get us back in. That hasn't happened. A few things that have happened have not been positive developments, including the breakdown of negotiations. We had our Senator Maggie Hassan was one of a handful of Democrats to cross the aisle to support a poison pill that I only half understand just a few weeks ago. Do you think there's any chance of, you know, we've been, I mean, I've been at New Hampshire Peace Action almost 13 years now, and one of the consistent themes is that there's always a push for a war with Iran, and it has moments like the assassination of General Soleimani, where it looks like it's going to happen and we barely pull it back, and then there are times where it's quieter. But I worry that this most recent set of developments is the end of a chance for that to fall off our radar as something that we need to be worried about. Do you have any hope that we can get to a more stable place in relations with Iran?
It's yeah, a really important question. I mean, I do have hope. I you know, there has been kind of too few of us, but a very committed, kind of steady voice calling attention, in particular, to the horrific sanctions regime, you know, against Iran. And I do think that Trump helped a bunch of progressive folks see. I mean, Trump was so, you know, he talked about annihilating Iran. He called it a maximum pressure was the sort of heading that they gave the approach to Iran. And I hope and I think that, you know, at least some people who maybe previously, for whatever reason, accepted the idea that Iran is this threat said, well, wait a minute, you know, if Trump, you know, the same guy who wants to build the wall and, you know, is against Black lives and, you know, wants to deport all Muslims, well, he's also doing this, well, maybe that's a bad thing. So And I think that, again, the impact of sanctions, particularly in light of the COVID pandemic, which has been catastrophic in Iran. And I do think that there's been some attention to that. And, you know, there is also this kind of, I think that US empire has really been struggling to find its footing. I actually think that Trump becoming the president was kind of part of that. I think that they were not, in Washington, they have not been united on a plan. And Trump came in and said, they said, what about this guy Trump? And he said, let's do all kinds of stuff. You know, let's back out of trade deals. Let's diss NATO, which he was doing. It's hard to remember that, but that was what Trump was doing with NATO, you know. So I do think that there was a kind of moment where there's been some conversation in Washington. It's like, okay, should we kind of cut our losses and kind of lower the temperature in some places so that we can focus on what we all care about, which is fighting China, which I'm sorry to say, there's a near consensus in Washington that China's the enemy. And I've wondered if in that context, there might be a little more space for a different path with Iran. I will say the momentum is so great against her. I mean, there really is this kind of bipartisan, it is so easy to impose sanctions on Iran, you know. It's so easy, as you all know, from experience, you know, working with your representatives. And I don't think that anything has sort of disrupted that. So we'll see, you know. I do think there's an opportunity. The fact that there were peace talks in Vienna, I think, is a hopeful sign. I think that there are people, you know, there are forces in both countries that want something different, but it really is going to take a big push from us. From us, meaning the people of this country, to demand something different. And I think that's part of the question. You know, I know we're coming toward the end, so this is like, when I think about what are we fighting for in a kind of demilitarized future, you know, there are, well, there's so much to do in terms of pulling back US militarism, in terms of stopping the harm, stopping the sanctions, you know, stopping these operations. But then in a more positive way, I think, like, what would it mean to actually reimagine the US's relationship with Iran? You know, I think about the fact that Iran was hit with COVID before the US. It was hit very hard. And then the US was hit. In the US, we've had the greatest death toll in the world. And I think, wow, what would things have looked like if, instead of seeing Iran as an adversary, the US had stopped sanctions and said, listen, we're going to not only let you access all of the medical, you know, supplies that you need, but also we're going to learn from, I mean, imagine if doctors from the US went to Iran, and nurses, and learned about COVID before it came here. It would. So anyway, I think that's the question, is how do we reimagine this relationship? Okay, and I see a hand up. So.
There is a hand. We are at the end of our time. Chris, can you make it quick?
Yeah, so I'll make it quick.
Right.
Thank you for bringing up the issue about sanctions in that particular case. And it also seems to be the go-to way for the United States to deal with international conflicts now. And do you see a way for us to get out of that, to get away from that? Because we've imposed sanctions so many places: Cuba, Venezuela, Iran. I can't think of all of them right now, but I'm sure that the list is much longer than my 10 fingers. So is there a way around that? Is there a movement that we can address precisely against using sanctions so inhumanely in so many cases?
It's a great question. It's a great place, actually, to kind of wrap up our conversation, because for two reasons. One is I'm very concerned that, actually, you know, there has been, again, too small but kind of growing conversation in this country that's like, oh, the sanctions really hurt people in Iran and in Venezuela, and I mean Cuba. You know, and they haven't achieved their objective either. I mean, this has been disastrous from a humanitarian perspective, but like, U.S. has had sanctions on Cuba for how many decades? That government hasn't fallen. Iran. It's there's no kind of defense or excuse for these sanctions. But for what it's worth, they're not even effective from kind of Washington's objectives. And so there has been a bit of a conversation about that. And tragically, the Russian invasion has been this context for the U.S. to put kind of unprecedented sanctions on Russia. And it's been a context where, for reasons that I understand and I'm sympathetic to, but I strongly disagree with, a lot of progressive folks have said, well, I usually don't like sanctions, but maybe in the case of Russia, it'll be a good thing. And again, they are hurting the most vulnerable people in Russia, not Vladimir Putin, but it's not, it's not just going to stay in Russia. It will be used to legitimize the whole US sanctions machine to then deploy elsewhere. I think that we have to not only make sure to call attention to the sanctions regimes that the US has around the world as we call attention to the wars, but it's especially important, I think, actually, for peace activists to do this, because the sanctions are framed as this alternative to war. Oh, don't worry, the US isn't going to invade Russia. We're just going to put sanctions on it. And what the experience of Cuba and Venezuela and Iran and Iraq and North Korea show us, sanctions aren't an alternative to war. One, they can be just as devastating as military operations. And two, they are usually used with military operations. I mean, Iraq is, for me, the prime example. The US invaded Iraq in 1991. It imposes sanctions on the country throughout the 90s while bombing intermittently through these no-fly zones during the sanctions regime. So it wasn't an alternative to bombing, it was with the bombing. And then the US invades again in 2003. So I think it's really important whenever US officials say, oh, don't worry, we're just going to impose sanctions, for us to say, wait a minute, we're anti-war activists. We are against wars, but we're against sanctions too, because that is another example of militarism. And we're going to talk about the reality of what these things do. And that's not the demilitarized future that we're talking about. And so it's incumbent on us to, along with and really kind of led by, people in Iraq and Haiti and Afghanistan, how do we co-create, an entirely different future.
Thank you so much, Kury, for being with us tonight. Deeply appreciate you taking some time, and I have deeply appreciated your brilliance through your writing for a long time. So it was great to finally meet you and to have you on tonight. This series is free and open to the public and will remain so. If you feel moved to give a gift, go to nhpeaceaction.org/donate. Our next few programs, June 5th will be live at Bear Brook. So this is our first in-person program. It'll be our annual meeting. And Sandra Yarney is going to talk to us about how to sustain ourselves during this time. She's a psychiatrist, from Portsmouth, who is going to talk to us about how we sustain ourselves while we do this work. Monday, June 6th is the next in the series. It's not going to be live streamed, so make sure if you want in, you come to the actual event. It'll be Scott Dickman, who is a longtime friend, and by then we'll probably, assuming that those attending elect him, will be a C4 board member of New Hampshire Peace Action. He's leading a discussion on the film Israel and de facto annexation. June 9th, we're going to have a discussion after you've had the chance to watch the film The Boys Who Said No, and we'll have Michael Ferber, who for several decades was a board member of New Hampshire Peace Action. He was arrested with William Sloane Coffin and Dr. Spock returning his draft card in 1970, I believe it was, and he's featured heavily in the film. He'll be on the panel, as will Emma, who works for 350 New Hampshire, which is another arm of New Hampshire Peace Action focused on climate change work. Then June 14th will be my last program before I take a 3-month sabbatical from June 15th to September 15th. And that's going to be me. I'm going to be talking about current events through my lens as an Iraq War veteran. So thank you all for being here. Thank you again, Kury. It was wonderful spending some time with you and hearing you, and keep writing. We depend on your brilliance to understand what's going on in the world. Good night, everyone.
Thank you all. Take care.